There's stories you want to tell, things you want to talk about, and if you have enough experience, there's some place in the world where somebody can use that and you find relevance for yourself. A good friend of ours had the Shackleton story for a long time in his mind to make into a film. A film director named George Butler. He's probably best known for having shot all the Pumping Iron and all those Arnold Schwarzenegger stills, and so he'd done that for a long time in New York, and he wanted to make the Shackleton story. Well, WGBH Boston got on board and decided to make the film, and Morgan Stanley, who was then a giant, it was before Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, was a giant investment company, and they IMAX films are almost all sponsored on some level, and so they became a great sponsor because they owned Discover Card at the time. So the idea was, well, we're going to take the greatest discoverer of all time, you know, and pair him up with Morgan Stanley and come up with a film, which all sounded really easy, except this is a film that you get no scout, because you can't scout the locations because it takes all the money that gets spent to make the film. You really can't have any cast because they'd have to live and work as crew to fit everybody on this ship. So all the ship and all the crew were actually cast. So we all had working clothes, and we all had period costume. And we went down there for 6 weeks the first time on a Russian icebreaker and shot all the stuff that was required there that we could get. And then they went back a second time to do the big expedition over South Georgia Island. So that was fun. Now, a little known fact that maybe Marshall knows, but not a lot of other people do, and that is that all the camp scenes on Shackleton's Antarctic Adventure were shot on Strawberry Reservoir in Utah, because the captain of the Russian icebreaker, the weather was so bad we were hitting hurricanes every other day down there, and he said, I'm not opening the front hold, because if I do, the ship's too vulnerable, and that's where all our props were. So we hauled all those props back to Strawberry Reservoir, fogged the whole background, and shot camp scenes and frozen people walking between tents out on the ice. And in those days, you edited on a flatbed, not on video, and so you got a little tiny image. And the first time we ever saw that shot was when it was projected at the premiere, and there's little snowmobiles going through the back in a period film. So it's a little bit uncomfortable, but I think only the people who see it on that format notice. You know, there's something about, I've discovered this in the last 10 years. There's something about television, because it seems to be repeatable and gives you longer character arcs to explore, that I find preferable to features. Features are great, but if you don't pick up a piece of that character's development in a feature, you don't have that many more minutes to solve it. So you know, in any medium, writing is key, but in television you have a little more flexibility. You get to know, as a director, you get to know the cast a little better, and so some of that synergy starts to work for you usually. And I think if you watch the later episodes of any series, they're doing their best work by then. Well, I grew up in the era where they were doing duck and cover drills and you were hiding under your desk because there was a threat of nuclear war. So the Cold War was my youth. And I read a series of books then called Alfred Hitchcock's Three Investigators. And it was just these three crazy kids who ran a detective service and solved minor crimes in the neighborhood. And I thought, wouldn't this be a great thing? And I teamed up with John Plummer, who was a writer friend of mine. And we reworked a script by a guy named James Shores, who had done a great job, but he didn't quite move into that fantasy world, and John helped us sharpen that up, and it's embarrassing to say, but it's largely biographical. Yeah. Well, Granite Flats was the first Utah-generated television series that ran alongside it. You know, we had Touched by an Angel, we had a lot of that stuff that came in because it's such a great place to shoot. But it was the first one that really was generated here and created here, and I think right now it set the pace for almost everybody. We brought in Christopher Lloyd, we brought in Parker Posey. Parker would have stayed on for 5 more seasons, probably if we'd let her direct. But I think what it showed was that we could do it, we could do Hollywood level production value in Utah for way less than you were spending in Los Angeles, and that wasn't just below the line, that we had creatives and we had art directors and production designers and amazing sound people here who could mix and shoot and post-produce a show locally. What was it like? No, Christopher would sit next to anybody on the set and tell them the story. He was happy. Any of his co-workers or actors who sat down and said, "What about this? What about that?" For me, he asked 3 questions. We got this initial interview. He said he wanted to do the job, and Christopher really found us. we were talking to his agent about another actor who was unavailable, and suddenly we get this call back. Jeff Miller, the series producer, got a call from his agent and said, you know, Christopher Lloyd wants to do this. And we all kind of went. So he called me on the phone, and the first thing he said was, can I have a mustache? I said, yeah, Chris, you can have a mustache, you know, that'll be fine. Okay, well, listen, I'll be there. And he showed up at the Little American. I sat with him in the lobby. We talked about the character for a while, and he said, all right, I'm looking forward to it. And I don't know what he had done in the more recent history, but the first day was really rough. He wasn't used to, I think he had like a 6-page scene or something that he had to have memorized. And but it took him about 3 or 4 days to get back in the saddle, and then for those last 2 seasons, he was just brilliant. That's a really good question. My favorite memory. You know, I had grown up for 3 years with those little kids who started out as chubby little spectacled kid, Charlie Plummer, who's now an amazing actor, the Mastroianni Prize at the Cannes Film Festival, and you know, Malia Tyler and Jonathan Haidt, who were all just kids. And they came to the audition for the first season, and they'd been kind of doing commercials in Disney, so they were a little bit happy hands. And we were going to make these kids into serious actors and actresses. And I thought, well, I think we can do it. They're all smart, they're all capable. So interestingly, by the time we got to, because kids change so much each year, by the time we got to season 3, they were young tweeners emerging on adulthood. And I remember the scene where, in this most intense moment in season 3, where Charlie's trying to figure out what to do with this terrible information he's just learned. He runs out in the hall and decides that his soulmate is Madeline and kisses her in the hallway. Well, that's the first time those two had ever kissed anything, let alone a human. And their first kiss is now recorded for all posterity on camera. And so Charlie was saying, you know, well, how does that work? And I said, well, you'll figure it out, you know, but just don't be nervous about it. You love this person. And Charlie and Malia both, I think, were able to get into character. And that moment is pretty magic in the film. And I think that was my favorite. That was there was rain coming down outside. Chris had done such an amazing job. It looked like an old hotel second floor. And he comes running out of the apartment, down to the end of the hall, and decides to kiss her. And when it was over, I don't think it was a lot of takes to preserve their bashfulness, but they did great work.
That's awesome. Very good.
Well, until I got there, BYU Television had largely been sports and exposing the university to both graduates and part of the Mormon culture, and then whoever else wanted to watch. I got coerced into going down there, and they said to me, see if you can make it watchable. And I said, I don't think so, I never watch it. And we got into this big argument, and I ended up down there. And luckily, we had the support of the ownership to be a gift of great content to the world. They didn't expect people to pay any attention to the fact that they were Mormon. They didn't expect people to, they didn't need to make money. They wanted us to be responsible, but not make money. And so the joy was we got to pretty much make it up. And we succeeded more than we failed. We had some terrible failures in the beginning trying to decide what pitches to trust. I took 300 pitches a year for shows, and we started about 11 original series, and 3 of those were scripted, so it was fun. Oh, it's crazy. Frank Marshall, Kennedy Marshall, Kathleen Kennedy now runs Lucasfilm. Frank Marshall has produced shows I could go on and on about. Came to me and said, he and I had worked together on an Olympic IMAX film for the Nagano Olympics. And he said, I want to do a thing with NASA, and I can get Lockheed to pay for it, because Frank can get anybody to pay for anything. So we went to those meetings, and what it turned out was that, you know, NASA had already sent 2 rovers to Mars, and it was a dismal failure. They crashed on landing, and there was an internal communications problem. So they wanted to document this one from the beginning onward. And the chief investigator for NASA, who sort of was resident at Jet Propulsion Lab, was a guy named Steve Squires. And Steve just sort of kicked the door open when we were available. I stood in a white suit and watched them pack the rovers for their way to Mars. We tracked them. I was standing in the room with Governor Schwarzenegger and everybody waiting for that first tone to come back that it had landed safely. And we caught that on film. The moment the tone came back, said it was safe, and the hurrah that went up in the room. So it was like being part of history as it was made. And we tracked it around. We tried to find a place to recreate Mars scenes, and we found a place in New Mexico. And so we had armed security guards who borrowed one of the Earth-based rovers, and we took it out to New Mexico and filmed that and put all those scenes together, and it was a very gratifying experience.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Right. So when you hear a news report anytime they find anything cool, and I get a report anytime they find anything, which is kind of fun. I get to hear, gee, we found these little nodules, we don't know what they are, you know, and they don't tell that to the press because they're trying to figure out whether the nodules have any oxygen or water in them. So that was fun to be in the know there. And I still pay attention to everything. I watch Mars films to see if they're doing it right, because we now know exactly what it looks like there. I watched the first high-resolution images come in from the surface as that thing unfolded and the rover drove off onto the dirt. So yeah, it keeps a place in your soul. It's the same thing with the Antarctic or with Yellowstone or with Egypt or any of those places I made IMAX films over those years. I worked in 50 countries, and a little bit of that stays with you all the time.
Why do
Yes. There's a gentleman who's well known to a lot of people now named Stan Ellsworth. And Stan had been doing, because he's such a large of heart and personality and physical frame, he had been doing bit parts as bouncers and bikers and etc. And I knew that he was a teacher as well, that he'd done a stint teaching history, but he wasn't foremost in my mind as somebody I wanted to cast, because BYU TV doesn't hold a lot of bikers and, you know, bouncers. So I thought, I don't know what that's going to be. Well, Jeff Miller, who's a long-term associate of mine and an amazing producer, currently doing Andy Mack for Disney, he came up to my office one day with Stan, and I thought, well, this is a favor Jeff's doing for Stan to bring this up. And they pitched an idea that I just kind of went, wow. You know, our idea was to violate expectations in the positive, and Stan's presentation of American history violates expectations. People don't expect him to know and to have the nuance of all those periods of history. And then we put him on a motorcycle, so that gave us that whole demographic. And then we ran him around the country, and people would see him filming in their town, so they'd tune in. And pretty soon we had a bona fide hit. He worked for Freedom Festival of Valley Forge, would go be a speaker all the time there, and did a stunning number of seasons. I can't remember how many. I think it's like close to 100 episodes of American Ride, taking us all the way from the early history of the United States up through the World Wars and into the present day. An amazing series. Exactly. And the other fascinating thing is that Stan, just as a person and as a performer, is unlike anyone else. That script is in his head. So he and the director get together in the morning, and he kind of gives the director a peek at what he's got in mind, and then he just talks, and it comes out. And it comes out in such a compelling way. And if you say, oh, we had a rollout, or that we had to change magazines or whatever, where did I get to at this point? Okay, he just walks around and has a chocolate milk and comes back, and you roll, and he just picks right up where he stopped with the same energy and could deliver the next 10 paragraphs word perfect from the last stuff. So it's really it was an amazing experience. I was on the set probably 4 or 5 times in different parts of the country, and had people come running up to us and say, oh, I see your show all the time, and it's like, we're trying to film here, and they would mob Stan. So he really gained popularity in that show. It's a really strange question. I graduated from school with a degree in film and theater directing. And as you probably know, no one cares. So you have to go find some work. And I found some work with some really brilliant commercial directors. And commercial directors have to kind of do everything because the creative is all over the map. And so I became the execution phase of a lot of really brilliant people's work. James Gartner and Kevin Kelly and Michael McLean, all those guys were making commercials at the time when I worked at their agency. And when I left to go freelance, I had this base of experience with everybody in LA, because we'd worked on high-end commercials, and everybody in this market who all knew me, and the IMAX world was just emerging. And so I became the guy that you go to when you got to go someplace either scary or dangerous or that nobody's been, because that was the calling card of IMAX. And I did it because I could and because it was fun, and probably because I don't have the attention span to write or direct much. I could do television, but I don't know if I could I have such admiration for feature directors who spend 2 or 3 years of their life doing something. I don't think I have that kind of attention span. But on these short, guerrilla, very clear creative objectives, very clear production objectives kinds of shows, that's where I shine. Probably on the national front, the people who've been most influential in my career would be Frank Marshall, because he's so well connected and was so gracious to teach me a lot of stuff about the way films are produced. Suzanne Simpson and Paula Apsel, who run Nova for WGBH, they were great contributors to the stuff I did. And then just in collaborations both in and out of Hollywood with Reed Smoot, who's an amazing cinematographer. I love Krista Murray, who's my favorite production designer. There's a sound mixer locally named Steve Laneri, and he and I have been on every set everywhere in the world doing stuff. So when Steve shows up, I know he's going to whine about the room tone forever. But yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. Certainly the most important aspect of filmmaking or being a department head on a film is talent and creativity. That really matters. But the second attitude there, the second thing is commitment. You have to be kind of all in, and there's nobody more all in than Reed is. He's older than I am, which makes him in the sort of at least the final chapters of his active career. And all through 3 seasons of Granite Flats, the guy wouldn't sit down. Unless he was on a dolly operating, he stood on the set. And my feet were collapsing by 2 hours in, and I was camping in my director's chair. He's standing there moving that crew along, so committed. And I could go in and say, I've got this and this and this plan, Reed. Does this fit the emotional tenure of the scene? He said, yeah, I would just add a high and wide at the end. So, he's so collaborative that you knew you had a safety net. And I know some of the other guys who worked for us as directors, Blair True and Sterling Van Wagen, and those guys appreciated so much working with Reed because you're not always that focused on how the thing's going to cut. You're focusing on whether you're getting these characters and this acting and this performance right. And Reed will say, I think you need this. And I'd say, oh, I don't need it. And he'd say, are you sure? You're going to want this later. And so we'd stop and get the shot and move on. That kind of give and take is terrific. I had done acting and I had directed actors. And so I came from a little bit of an acting background, thanks to my university training. And those skills were kind of dormant. So when I got back into it, I realized that I'd been working with a lot of documentary and IMAX directors over the years who really hadn't specialized in performance and didn't really know how to talk to actors. So it was delightful just to get to know some amazing actors and see the way they like to work. And it doesn't take a jillion takes to get a great performance. It doesn't take all day long. These people, the good ones, come with a performance and you're just fine-tuning it to fit the moment in time that you're trying to capture for that scene. And I stand in awe of amazing actors. They really are user-friendly. They really aren't temperamental. They don't have ridiculous demands. The worst thing we ever had to deal with Christopher Lloyd is that when he starts to lose energy a little bit, he has to go out into the craft service vehicle and sneak a peanut butter sandwich. He's right back on top in a few minutes. You get to learn those things about what keeps these people running, and it's not sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's incredible professionalism, creativity, preparedness when they come to work. Yeah, who would have thought clean comedy would work? We were very surprised. Jared Shores, who was my assistant when we were doing content there, actually went from my assistant to being the head of content to being the executive producer of Studio C, who was very brilliant, walked in my office and we were scrambling for new content. And he said, there's a comedy troupe at BYU called Divine Comedy. And I said, yeah, I've seen their stuff. It's funny. It's very topical. It's very Mormon. And he said, no, I think we could broaden that out into family stuff. So he and Matt Meese got together and we shot a pilot. And we could tell from the pilot that the format was wrong, but but there was something there. And I think the secret to Studio C is that you've got performers at heart who get in that studio audience format and just shine. They're good on the offsets too, but when they get in that studio audience format, and we had a 250-seat theater, and we would have 11,000 requests for every audience that time. So you had to pick 250 people by lottery out of that, and those, so they come, they're so motivated to be there, and the reaction just plussed all the performances immensely, and really some brilliant writing and creativity. It was fun to do. I remember watching SNL as a kid, and of course being like everyone else, amazed with the ability to be funny. But I also remember watching them and thinking, yeah, for everyone that's really funny, I'm putting up with 4 or 5 that are meh, And I thought, I bet we could get to half. I bet we could get to the half of them are funny. That was always my goal. And Jared said, oh no, we can do that. And the funny thing is, we got there. We got so that people would say, hey, I like about half of these are amazing. And I thought, great, just tell us which half and we'll do 2 halves of that. It's all different, depending on your point of view, your age, where you came from. So they all listed different sketches. I think probably Scott Sterling, the soccer sketch, appealed to everyone. But some of the others, it was all over the map as to who liked what sketches and who it related to. So they went on Conan the other day, and he interviewed them and talked about the thing, and they are in their, I believe, their 9th season right now. Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think as they're very creative and talented cast members, as they tire of it and move on, they'll bring up new casts and continue to work. Like I said earlier, everything is in the writing, and writing funny is the hardest writing there is. Even I can write drama for a few pages. I'm a great rewriter. I keep telling the writers they don't like that idea, but I'm a great rewriter. I can't come up with stuff that funny. So someone who really gets the science. We actually hired, for a period of time there, one of the ex-head writers from the Carol Burnett show, and he taught us so much about sketch comedy. Here's the things you can do. You can hit this twice, but you can't hit it 3 times. You can, there is a science to what's funny, and then there's just brilliance that polishes it off. I'm working for a company called Radiant, and it's a media advocacy company. It's a lot of short form stuff, and it's a lot of fun. We do a weekly show called Life Crunch, and it's a host talking about if your kids hear frightening things in the news at school, here's a way to approach news stories with them. I'm developing some scripted series that we'll eventually revisit with either Radiant or with Radiant to Netflix or Radiant to Amazon. So it's really good stuff. I'm still working with the same writers that helped me on Extinct and Granite Flats, etc., and they've been really terrific. Yes, like every other industry, the people that are good and really have a skill to do it or who will apply themselves, you'll rise to the top. You'll rise to the top and you'll end up in a place where you can have the most influence. I really believe that. Think of all the actors we know who went to LA and waited tables for 10 years and got discovered and are amazing. Well, you may be PAing or seconding or thirding on a show for a while, but I tell everybody from universities who say, oh, I want to go be a film worker, I'll say, look, offer to carry cases for the DP for a week. Because by the end of that week, you'll have done such an amazing job because you've worked so darn hard, they can't not hire you as a loader on the next film or whatever, you know. And I think every time someone's followed through on that, it's worked. So I'm involved with the Film Commission in an initiative to try to get people to come out of film school here who want to work here in the industry, to convince them that probably directing and writing off the bat isn't going to happen, at least in the industry sense. They've certainly got an iPhone and an iMac, they can do it. But they should get on the set and see what's going on there and learn it. So we have a PA program that's working terrifically. But I think the crew, regardless of what visitors from LA may or may not think, are first level crew. You know, people who bring their keys here are always, you know, loyal to those relationships, and I understand that, but there are keys here who are as good as almost anybody you can bring from LA. There are keys in all departments. There are keys in sound and in camera and in art department, and transportation guys are really stunning here and highly motivated to be good and helpful in all departments. So it's because we raise largely non-union crews and then they evolve into union crews, everyone's used to helping everyone, and it's a calmer, more friendly, more exciting set with very little conflict. You know, landscape is the operative word, I believe, in Utah. My early projects were all here because of the landscape of Utah, because you can shoot New York in a 4-block area downtown, you can shoot, you know, the moon on the salt flats, you can go to slot canyons and red rock and forests, and it's such an amazing landscape, so near, so compact to a measured metropolitan area with culture and capability and all that it started out as people just coming for the landscape. John Ford shooting, you know, in the Monument Valley in the southern Utah areas. I mean, it's gone from that all the way to now people are saying, wow, not only is there amazing landscape, there are crews, there are facilities, there are studios, there are support services here that make this all possible. I think it's the great undiscovered gem of the world, and people that are discovering it now are going to be the pioneers forever. Well, I've obviously worked in a lot of countries and in a lot of strange places, but I've also worked in a lot of the studios in the LA area, so I know what the standard is there. You know, I've shot stuff on Universal's lot and at Buena Vista and done stuff at Disney, and it's truly a world-class facility. There's really, those of us who work here and haven't been able to squeeze our time in edgewise are all very jealous of the shows that come here and occupy the studio forever, because it's such a fantastic thing. When you're doing what other Utah productions have to do when this is busy, you're screwing down plywood to the floor of an abandoned gymnasium someplace and building sets on it. This has a stunning floor, 35-foot high grid, you know, stages that can now be linked into one giant mega stage if you want to do it. Room for huge psychs, effects stuff, motion capture. It really is a facility that's worthy of the amazing landscape it's plunked in the middle of.